This week on Cumulus on Cloud, we're going to talk about how to get to continuous deployment. And we're going to do it by talking about GitLab and Kubernetes merged together. When most people hear the term continuous delivery, or even better yet, continuous deployment, they kind of stand back and they say, oh, well, someday we'll get there. Someday we'll be able to implement this perfect system that can enable all these wonderful functions for us. Well, I'm here to say that that day is actually today for many applications. Certainly, if you're serving hundreds of millions of requests a second in your environment, getting to continuous deployment, continuous delivery processes is going to take some work. There certainly is a lot of overhead in those sorts of systems. But for many people, we can actually implement a simple solution today and get it up and running. And then over time, as your load grows, we can add enhancements and improve the performance of the system, improve the efficiency of the delivery and deployment solutions. And yet you can still get the benefits of that starting with a simple solutions model. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you realize that I'm a huge fan of tools that are not dedicated to any one particular environment. I guess I am somewhat biased towards x86, Intel, and Linux-based environments today. But that's not really a requirement. It just happens to be that those are the best tools for doing the sorts of things that I find people want to do with their applications. In the same way, I look at container applications, containerized applications, and the orchestration of those containerized applications by using a tool like Kubernetes, because Kubernetes allows you to implement in just about any environment possible. And the other tool that I find is really useful in this space is GitLab. Now, there are plenty of Git repository tools out there. There are plenty that are open source. There are plenty that you can deploy, even if they're closed source, into your own environments. There are also continuous integration tools, both SaaS and private tools, that you can implement, again, either in the cloud or on your own premises. I just find GitLab to be useful because there's a community that's really trying to improve the system based on how people are consuming it, rather than just on how a product manager thinks it should be consumed. And not that product managers don't take customer feedback, but we have the entire community providing feedback into the GitLab environment. I find that to be really powerful, and over even the past 6 months, I've seen massive changes in the continuous integration pipeline and the continuous delivery and deployment pipeline capabilities that are only getting better as time goes on. So I really am pretty positive on this community versus enterprise model that the GitLab organization has actually managed to continue to support and continue to deliver on. So that's enough of an ad on GitLab. The other reason I like GitLab, though, is for this concept of building out a simple pipeline, a simple end-to-end pipeline, and one that you have some lifecycle control over, not just from the perspective of your application lifecycle, but the operatable lifecycle, the underlying infrastructure and services and resources. Deploying GitLab has gotten a lot easier with tools like Helm on top of Kubernetes. So suddenly I'm talking Kubernetes again when here I was talking about GitLab. But the deployment of these applications is becoming easier, and it's becoming easier to operate. If you want to do an upgrade, often the upgrade is as simple as telling Helm to upgrade the chart. This is the simplest possible solution that we can have for a piece of infrastructure, where in the past the upgrade process might have been shut that one down after we've brought up another one and migrated all our data to it. There were some old school, even open source projects that lived in that domain. So we're seeing a big shift in how systems function and how they operate, but the thing I find interesting is understanding how all the pieces fit together. So looking at GitLab, which provides, yes, a Git source code repository, but it also incorporates the Docker registry components, Docker delivery, embedded into it, so that we actually have a proper, at least Docker artifact repository, and that's our Docker registry for our Docker-based containers. The GitLab community has built this concept of auto DevOps. So if you just deploy an application into Git, into the Git source code repository, and you have in that source code repository a Docker file, for example, and possibly also some additional instruction files that we can get into, the system will actually take that and automatically run a continuous integration process, which will build the container because there's a Docker file locally defined. It'll build that container, store it in the registry, and even try to run some tests against that particular environment. At a minimum, it'll do a code analysis against the environment just to see if your source code meets standard code processing guidelines. Now, it uses an interesting set of tools to do that. Another open source project called Heroku-ish. And this is a project that took the model of the Heroku platform as a service you can still get today. It's a very popular, very powerful service. But it took that same model of taking a set of default input structures and turning them into a production grade container, a resource that can then be deployed into multiple locations. Well, we can then take that one step farther because we can integrate Kubernetes as a target into our environment with a tool like Helm and a Helm chart. And again, if I create a Helm chart and I place it in a charts directory in my repository, in the root of my repository, my Git repository, the system will again see that and by default will assume that as long as there's a Kubernetes cluster attached to that project, that it can then deploy that chart into the Kubernetes cluster. So we could get to most likely a staging environment. So maybe we haven't gotten fully to deployment, but we've gotten to an initial stage of delivery so that we have a staging environment that we can run some tests against. And if we actually define our Helm chart to include environments, so they're different models for production or for release, I can actually deploy not just my application, but I could deploy a set of test containers as well, containers that can actually test my application in that same environment. We go one step further and saying if those tests all pass, and I can now write an artifact back to the system to say the tests passed, I can actually trigger another run against that repository and push into production. So suddenly, within one platform, within one environment, I can build a model. It's not maybe as flexible as something like Spinnaker for continuous delivery. It may not have all the bells and whistles that a tool like Jenkins has built up over years of practice working with Java-based environments, as an example. But it has all the core components and it lets me get a system up and running. And again, one of my biggest benefits of a tool like GitLab, and any tool that lives in that domain, I'm not saying again that GitLab is the only tool, but a tool like GitLab where I can take it and deploy it into one cloud or deploy it into my own private environment, if I have a private cloud or a virtual machine data center that I can work with, I can deploy that environment, and if I decide to, I can deploy it again somewhere else, because I can use the community edition if I decide to, or if I want support, I can get the enterprise edition, so I have the ability to even get support for this application environment. And all those pieces come together to actually provide a holistic whole. What I'm going to do over the next couple of episodes is I'm actually going to walk through effectively a hands-on process of implementing GitLab in a cloud environment, and I think we're probably going to use Google in this particular case. We're going to deploy GitLab into a cloud environment. We're going to target a Kubernetes cluster. So we're going to deploy GitLab on top of Kubernetes. And then we're going to deploy a Kubernetes cluster. Well, actually, we're going to point back to the same one. We'll do this really cleverly. We'll take our running GitLab, we'll point back to our Kubernetes environment, and we'll actually deploy a little tiny application into that environment. So stay tuned for the actual hands-on process of getting these pieces fitting together. But I think you'll be able to see at the end of this that you can take a tool like GitLab in conjunction with a powerful orchestration engine like Kubernetes and an application packaging management tool like Helm, and we can actually build a continuous delivery or even continuous deployment process. And all of that with open source tools that you can deploy into any location in any fashion that you desire. I think this is incredibly powerful. It incorporates at least some of the initial components of an end-to-end managed operable system. So we start looking at things like how do you monitor and manipulate this environment? How do I make sure that I have the ability to scale the environment? All of those pieces have to be in place for true operability. And some of them we can actually do very simply with this simple systems model of GitLab managing most of our resources and deploying into a production Kubernetes environment. Well, folks, thanks for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to like it. Hit that thumbs up button. We always like to know that we're doing a good job. Don't forget to share this with your friends, and just to make sure that you get the latest and greatest episodes that we release, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the little bell next to it so that you actually can get notified when they come out. Thanks so much for joining us.